Hello, everyone. Thank you for attending the Save the Frogs Academy class about the pet trade. My name is Michael Starkey, and I'm the advisory committee chairman and an ecologist for Save the Frogs. And I'm very happy to have you all join us. We have a very long presentation today, and so I'm not going to spend too much time with the introduction, and I'm going to get right into the class. So today we're going to learn all about the pet trade. And if you have any questions, I'm going to try and answer as many as I can at the very end of the presentation. And so if you have a question, please think about it and type it into the question sections or the chat section. So I'll be able to answer that later. And we're also joined today by Dr. Kerry Kriger, who will be also attending and presenting this presentation as well. So to get started, let's learn about the amphibians in the pet trade. So current issues facing amphibians in the pet trade and what you can do about it. And to get started, we need to understand that amphibians are some of the most threatened group of organisms on the planet. And with so many threats facing amphibians, number one being habitat destruction, but invasive species, overharvesting, climate change, pollution, there's so many threats that are causing these widespread declines of amphibians around the world. And so where does, what's the problem with pets? How do pets fit into this? And so I mentioned overharvesting, and so I'm going to get into that. But if we need to understand what the problem with pets, amphibians are, we need to see, well, we need to ask ourselves a question. So how can the ownership of my pet frog, I have a pet frog, and how could it hurt amphibian populations around the world? And simply, we have to ask ourselves a second question: is that, well, was your pet frog stolen from the wild, or taken out of the wild, or was it a wild-caught amphibian? And so, by asking this question, we can then track, well, where did that frog come from originally? And so, we're going to get into that right away. And so, if we're talking about wild-caught amphibians, so amphibians that go from the wild, they go to a dealer, so an importer, and then they come to the consumer. So we're going to see this kind of chain of events from the beginning to the consumer, the person purchasing the pet frog. And it's true and it's been proven that the overharvest of amphibians has contributed to a decline of amphibian populations around the world. There's about 100 million amphibians shipped around the world for pets, for food, for bait, for laboratory uses. And so it's important to understand that the pet trade has had an impact on amphibian populations. And we're going to talk the first example being Colombia. So, with the illegal exportation, is a huge problem where amphibians are being illegally smuggled. And if Dr. Kerry Kriger is on the line, perhaps he can chime in a couple words about that. Let's see.
Yeah, I was in Colombia in April and May, and we started Save the Frogs Colombia. Colombia is a biodiversity hotspot. There's many amphibian species there, and there's also a lot of problems because even though it's illegal to export a native amphibian from Colombia, there are villages with especially colorful frogs nearby that are highly sought after in the pet trade. So some of these poison dart frogs, such as a Dendrobates terribilis, they're living in places where people don't have a lot of money. And I know that in some villages, people offer, it's kind of organized crime. There will be a guy who just has a standing deal. If you bring me this frog that I'm looking for, then I'll pay you $2 to $5 or so. So people may not have a lot of money and they take them up on that offer. Next thing you know, the frogs are in decline. And in America, we import several million wild-caught frogs into the country legally each year. There's also a black market. And if you consider that America is only thought to represent about 15% of the world's wild frogs that are in use for pets, there's probably 100 million plus frogs taken out of the wild each year. So in Colombia, we're fortunate to have some very talented biologists there who are very interested in saving the frogs. And in one city, Cali, there's a group of undergraduates who have formed a Save the Frogs Cali, and they have been educating people on Save the Frogs Days for all 5 years that we've held that event. And they submitted a proposal to me, and it's for $1,500 in funding, and it was very well written, and I would love to be able to fund them. So hopefully some of you by the end of this presentation will be inspired to donate or fundraise. We've raised 600 of that $1,500, and basically what they're going to do is travel to these towns, some of which are kind of remote and potentially even in slightly dangerous areas, and they're going to go out there and educate the school kids about the importance of frogs and not collecting them. And from that, there will be kids who like frogs who then go home and tell their parents. And I think it's a really important project, so if anyone can donate to assist us with that, it would be great. This frog we're looking at is the Dendrobates terribilis, and I saw this frog in Parque Explora, which is a well-known science museum in Medellin, Colombia. And this frog had actually been taken, or it had been seized by police in the airport as someone was trying to smuggle it out of the country. So now it's living in Parque Explora, educating people about frogs and the problems they face. So we'd rather have these frogs out in the wild, and with our educational activities that Save the Frogs does, that's what we hope to just educate at a minimum, make sure that people know that there are potential negative effects of the pet trade, and that certain frogs especially they're already threatened, and they don't need the additional problems posed to them by people coming and taking them out of the wild to sell them as pets. So with that, I'll turn it back to Michael.
Great, thank you for that, Kerry. And that's just one example, but there's many actually that have been observed around the world. And for example, recently Manga Bay published a great interview with Dr. Brian Stewart, who's a herpetologist that works in the country of Laos. And I highly recommend everyone review this article. It's called "The Dark Side of a New Species Discovery," where Dr. Brian he found that when he was going out to his research sites, he was working with this one newt called the Laos newt. And if you can see from the photo, it's a beautiful newt. It has almost this armored skin, and it's a black and tan coloration. It's quite beautiful, and it's also quite rare. It's only found on a few isolated streams in this area of Laos. And I want to read this text that he talked about because what happened was, well, I'll just say straight from him. So there is a demand to have a rare species in private hobbyist collections. What I never anticipated would happen is that the commercial collectors use the scientific description of the species, use the actual scientific journal as a sort of a roadmap for how to go and find it, meaning the newt, and commercially exploit it for profit. So collectors were actually going out with his research study site information where they were and collecting this animal. And then what happened was, both almost simultaneously, some commercial collectors from Germany and commercial collectors from Japan converged on the small geographic area in Laos where it occurred, and illegally, without permission, started collecting these animals and paying local people to collect them. Ultimately, very large numbers of these animals were illegally taken out of Laos and sold for a very high value in Japan and Europe. And actually, when we started looking into how much these animals were, they were being sold for over 200 euros, so which is over almost $300 US. And the people were being paid between 20 and 30 cents per newt. And so you can see that there creates this trade, this demand for these animals. And simply, many of these amphibians are very brightly colored, and so that's why collectors are out to get them. So another example of how this is a problem. And so let's go find, so when these animals are taken out of the wild, they have to travel thousands of miles to get to your door. And there's a particular video that has been surfaced, or undercover investigators went to these importers. So they were getting these animals from the wild and seeing what happens to these amphibians and actually reptiles as well when they're in these places. And so this is an example. These animals have traveled thousands of miles, crowded inside these plastic water bottles. Many of them had been deprived without food for days to weeks. Some of them have very little water. And so this is obviously very stressful for the animals. And many of these animals, when they become stressed, many die in the process. Simply, amphibians are very, very sensitive species, and stress can kill them. And also, some of these animals are harboring diseases or have parasites that make them also easy to succumb to stress, and they will die on this process. And so I highly recommend people look at this video. And one might look, well, okay, this video, this is blown way out of proportion. But is it blown out of proportion? Is this standard practice, or is this animal cruelty? And so this is something that I asked this question. And so if people are in the pet trade, and if they go to these importers or exporters, they maybe look like, okay, is this standard practice for these animals and how we take care of them to bring them to the consumer? But from out of the country to the importers, usually in LA, Los Angeles area, or the major ports in Florida, these animals are then distributed all over the United States, or it could be going to Germany and other countries as well. But so they go, to your backyard store. And so many independently family-owned stores, they have long lists that they can order these amphibians from. And then also there's the big box stores. So there's, Petco, PetSmart, that are able to, have all these animals to help distribute them. And if we just think about how many pet stores are around the world, especially in the United States, well, there's a lot, and there's many that carry amphibians. And so many of these species are wild caught amphibians. And so it just tells you how much of a demand that there really is for these animals. And then, actually, before I move forward, I also want to talk about something that was quite surprising, that I wanted to bring up. That sometimes when you look for a pet, you don't always go to the pet store. Brookstone is almost like it's like I like to call it the nice thing store. There's a lot of tech gadgets and nice comfortable chairs, and just it's kind of like a department store for very techy type things. But they sell a lot of office, I guess, items as well. And they started carrying this, and it's called the Frogosphere, which is as stated, a self-contained ecosystem that's easy to care for. And what it is less than maybe half a gallon of water with two African clawed frogs in it, a snail, and some plants. And basically, they're trying to put this animal that naturally would live in open bodies of water, be able to fully move around, and to confine it in such a small space. To give you an idea, I mean, this box is the size of our hand, and they were putting two frogs in it. Well, we can now say that it was successfully removed from Brookstone, and actually Target was carrying it as well. And obviously, they don't carry it anymore as well. I think you can still buy it online. But just how unfortunate that these animals were subjected to such horrible living conditions. And so, moving on. And so the next place is the internet. So it really is true that you can buy anything on the internet, and amphibians as well. And so many amphibians are sold online. And so there's multiple websites that have these online classifieds where you can browse them and find so many different types of amphibians. And if you look down the list, these are the salamanders and newts. So many of these species, some are captive bred, which I'll go into later. Some are wild caught. And there's just such a diversity of species that you can acquire. And some, you start browsing these, you start looking at what species are available. And granted, this is in the United States, remember. For example, the Cuban tree frog. It's an invasive species in Florida. It originally comes from Cuba. It's the largest tree frog in Florida. It's actually quite large. And it's been eating, lizards and other frogs. And it's out competing the native species. But if we go online, if I wanted to buy a Cuban tree frog, well, there we go. There's one in the top right here, an albino Cuban tree frog, ironically sold in Fort Myers, Florida. And that brought a question to my mind. And this search was from today. And also down here, we can find red-eyed tree frogs, waxy monkey, reed, and Cuban tree frogs from a place in Oceanside, California. But so back to Florida, and it's interesting that I went on the Florida Fish and Game site and trying to find out if you can actually own these animals. And while there's nothing that says you can't, they have a lot of information that says how the destruction are causing the ecosystem. But plainly, if they're being sold online, you can legally own them. And another species that I found was the marine toad. And so this image is taken from the Florida Fish and Game website. And the marine toad is also known as the cane toad. And if anyone is from Australia or knows Australians, they know that the marine toad has caused quite devastation for the wildlife in Australia, and over the last 60 years has basically led to declines in any species that tries to eat it. And it's been quite alarming what this toad has done. They're native to South and Central America, but they're also an invasive species in Florida. And they're also causing a lot of problems. But again, if we go online, and we see right here, marine toad, Bufo marinus, search from today, this Glades Herp Farm is an importer from Florida. And so you can go out and buy these frogs. And so it's important to understand that you really can get these animals from anywhere. Most of these distributors, whether they're importers or they're private breeders, they're selling these animals all over the world, and especially in the United States. And we'll get more into that soon, but a lot of these animals are wild caught, and that's, again, problem for species that if these animals were to ever get out. And then the next place you can find amphibians for sale are the reptile amphibian shows. So these are similar, like a trade show, a giant pet show where breeders can bring their animals and they can sell them. Pet stores can have a table and sell their animals. And a lot of times, many of these animals are kept in these crowded conditions. You can see in these plastic containers for a few days, sometimes a week, depending on where the show is. And granted, it's only a temporary amount of time, but these animals are kept in these kind of crowded conditions as they're being sold. And a lot of species can actually sometimes be wild caught, again, amphibians that are being sold. They can actually be species that are endangered or illegal to have. And so it's important that the consumer isn't necessarily aware of what they're getting when they're going to these reptile amphibian shows, because also a lot of times it's a very impulse market. It's like, buy this frog right now. It doesn't matter if you know how to take care of it. Buy it now, set that up later. And so that's one problem at these reptile amphibian shows. And so when it finally gets to the consumer, we can see that these amphibians, if they're wild caught, have traveled so far. And if that consumer doesn't know how to take care of these animals, they're going to die. And that's unfortunately the problem, is that so many species they're so stressed in captivity. They often have parasites that, under that stress, they typically they obviously compromise the body quite a bit. And so if the person that owns the frog doesn't know how to properly take care of it, these animals die. And so that's a problem. And so a big problem that people need to have this proper husbandry in mind. And so as a response to this, so the pet trade, so many species of amphibians are being taken out of the wild. We created this info card, and we have a website, savethefrogs.com/pets, where people can learn about the problem with the pet trade. And we have a list of statements about how people can help, not only to stop this trade of wild-caught amphibians, but how to be a responsible pet owner. And I'm going to go through some of these and tell you why we've talked about them. And so one, don't buy it. Don't buy this amphibian if you can't care for it. And simply, it's, can you recreate a rainforest in a 10-gallon terrarium, in a 20-gallon terrarium? Amphibians are specialized animals that require just a level of care that the average individual doesn't quite understand. Some of them need high humidity requirements or drier conditions. Amphibians come from a variety of habitat. So not only are you trying to create a rainforest, but that species' particular ecosystem you're trying to recreate in a habitat. So it's important to really understand, if you can't take care of it, then don't buy it. Don't be impulsive to buy these animals. And if you can't keep your frog, because many people find that if it's too much of a care, or for example, if people, one problem is that in the Western states, if you go to a pond store or a pet store, sometimes you can buy bullfrog tadpoles. And bullfrogs are actually an invasive species in the state of California, and actually most along the West. And they buy these tadpoles and they metamorphose into frogs. And so what was bought originally as this, little tadpole has now become this little frog that, if they keep feeding it, it's going to be quite large, actually the size of a small football. And so most people can't take care of such a large frog. They didn't expect that. So it's important to, if you can't keep your pet amphibian, to find a herpetological society in your area. So herpetology is the study of reptiles and amphibians, and they're around the country. There are great groups that promote this responsible herp keeping. And find one in your area and find someone that can take care of them, because there's great specialists out there that know how to take great care of amphibians. Sometimes nature centers, zoos will take amphibians as well, but you can't count on that though. And also reptile rescues or amphibian rescues are great. I say reptile rescue because unfortunately most amphibians do not make it to the rescue stage, because as I said, so many die from not having the proper care that they don't make it to the rescue stage. So moving forward, never buy wild-caught amphibians, and for the obvious reasons. We don't want to support this trade of these wild-caught animals. And if you must have a pet amphibian, always buy captive-bred. And so the difference between the two, obviously, wild-caught is animals that have been taken out of the wild, and captive-bred are a generation that actually the parents they're in captivity and they breed, and you have their offspring. So that's what captive-bred is. And not only, we always say captive-bred because captive-bred amphibians are going to be healthier, they're going to be adjusted to a life in captivity, and they're not going to be traveling very far. So it's very important. If you must have a pet amphibian, always go captive bred. And I want to say a quote from herpetologist and TV show, um, I guess idol or icon Mark O'Shea had a great quote about the herpetoculture community and the hobby. And so he is a herpetologist and he does a lot of work in Indonesia and Papua New Guinea. And this quote came up from when many of his study species were actually being exported out of the country, and I think it was illegally. But it's important to just, his quote says a lot. And while he's talking about reptile enthusiasts and reptiles in general, it's also the same applies to amphibians as well. And so he says, a very sad reflection on the hobby. Do reptile enthusiasts know where some of their prized possessions come from and the misery and illegality of the trail from the wild to the vivarium? I have long said how much I disapprove of the wild trade and especially the illegal wild trade. Here is a sample of what is on offer from people who care a lot more about money than the species involved. To true reptile enthusiasts, and by that I mean people who like or love reptiles and amphibians, I'll throw that in there, not the finance they represent. I would say take great care where and whom you get your animals from. If it is too good to be true, then it is probably illegal. Go captive bred, and if you possibly can, before wild caught. So that's a great quote from Mark O'Shea. And then we want to help prevent the spread of infectious diseases. And so the chytrid fungus is a amphibian fungus that now has been detected over 385 species of amphibians all over the world. It's resulted in declines of dozens, if I think about over 100 species of amphibians. It's a very nefarious disease, and it's been shown to be in amphibians, and so in the pet trade. And so, with over 100 million amphibians are being shipped around the world, um, all this trade is unregulated in the sense that there's no disease testing. And so, if I ship my frog from California to Florida, there's no test that proves that this animal is chytrid free. If that animal gets out, or water from its holding container gets out, and that goes into an adjacent body of water, I might have infected an entire new population of frogs that previously did not have the chytrid fungus. It's important to understand that fact. And so, and actually, there was a great study in 2011, and all of these studies that I referenced, they can be found on the savethefrogs.com/pets page for anyone that's interested. And so a study found that in many pet shops and pet expos, those reptile shows I was talking about, nearly 3% of the captive amphibians tested positive for the presence of chytrid, and 13.6% of the collections yielded at least one positive result. That's a very high level of chytrid infection, and to be shipping these animals around the world without any disease testing, that's not good for amphibians. Okay. And then, so in response to this, many countries have actually banned certain types of amphibians because of their high level of chytrid prevalence. And for example, South Korea and Japan both banned the importation of bullfrogs. Now, the trade of bullfrogs is due mostly for food, but they are also kept as pets. So it's important to understand that both. But this widespread of amphibians, the bullfrogs in particular, had high levels of chytrid fungus in those collections that were being shipped. And another problem that people don't necessarily think about when these bullfrogs are shipped around, just because I have this slide up, what we have is a photo of a big American bullfrog and a native California red-legged frog engaged in plexus. So it's the male California red-legged frog on top of this big bullfrog. And one might ask, well, if we have these pet frogs, they get too big. Like some people have actually told me that their pet bullfrogs got too big, so they release it out into the wild. And this is a problem for native amphibians like this California red-legged frog, because this frog could surely eat it. But when they're engaged in plexus, there's a fear about hybridization. Well, these two actually can't hybridize, even though there are some species that can. But the problem here is that when these bullfrogs are in these red-legged frog ponds, so this is in California, you naturally have red-legged frogs, or one of the largest frogs in the Central Valley of California. Bullfrogs came in, they hung out by the ponds, and California red-legged frogs come during the winter rains and then usually leave. They're not always by the ponds. Naturally, male red-legged frogs would come in and they would call, attracting females to the pond, and thus breeding would occur. But when these male red-legged frogs come to these ponds, they actually found these big, gorgeous frogs, these big green bullfrogs. And like a typical male, they don't discriminate very much, jokes aside, but they, immediately engage in a plexus and they don't call. And what actually has happened is that they found that these red-legged frog ponds, over a period of time, the population of red-legged frogs gets so small because those females never come and there's no recruitment. And so it's so important that if we're releasing these big frogs, you might have an effect like this. And so something that we didn't think about when we're, again, having all these amphibians shipped around the world. So another threat that faces these frogs. And so in response to all this, back to the chytrid fungus, in the 17th of September of 2010, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service published a notice of inquiry for a petition to list amphibians as injurious wildlife under the Lacey Act, unless certified as free of chytrid fungus. So this was basically a disease test to make sure that all those amphibians that are being shipped around were being cleared of chytrid fungus. Unfortunately, this is still under review, and it's been so long. And so this is something that is good, good wildlife management that's being put into place, but it's taking too long, as so many amphibians are still being shipped around the nation and around the world. And so with that, it is the responsibility of the pet, food, bait, and laboratory industries to prove their amphibians are disease-free, rather than the responsibility of amphibians to attempt to survive on a planet that humans have covered in lethal pathogens. There has been so much resistance to these testing regulations, and it's very, very important. If we're going to protect amphibian populations, we have to stop the spreading at the source. And the trade of amphibians, whether for food, for laboratory, bait, or pets, has contributed to the spread of infectious diseases. So it's important that we support that when we can. And so with that, we should never, ever release our pets into the wild. It doesn't matter if it's, a native species or it's, your long-loved pet frog. Always make sure that it stays. If you cannot take care of it, find someone that can. Very, very important for that. And so, because like I said, these invasive species are a really big threat to amphibians, like this bullfrog here has caused quite many declines in native species in California and actually all over the west coast of the United States. And so with the last part of that is that we want to keep amphibians wild and free. And so just amphibians have a right to stay in the wild, and they should stay in the wild, and thus keeping those wild populations intact with one less threat facing them. And really quickly, I'd like to see if Dr. Kriger has any thoughts before I move on to the next stage of this presentation.
Hi, thanks, Michael. Yeah, I have a lot of different thoughts that I've been writing down. They're not in any particular order, so I'll just go through some of them. The red-eyed tree frog, which we happen to be looking at right now, is one of the most iconic frogs. Most people, or many people around the world, recognize it because it's so highly photographed. And it's really sad that a few years ago, an international body called CITES, the Convention for on International Trade in Endangered Species, had to list this species, and actually 5 different Agalichnus species, that's the scientific name, got listed. So it's great that there are governmental bodies taking action. What that means is that you're no longer allowed to ship that frog, take it out of the wild, and trade it or sell it. But it's really sad that one of the world's most famous frogs, if not the world's most famous frog, is being brought to the edge of extinction based largely on people's desires to have it as a pet in their house. So the next thing, chytrid fungus, Michael was talking about, that's my scientific specialty. I did my PhD in Australia. I spent 4 years there studying the ecology of chytridiomycosis in Eastern Australia, and I'll be talking all about that at an upcoming Save the Frogs Academy class. I think it's a couple weeks from now. And so please definitely learn more about chytrid fungus during that class, and we will have a very special guest. Michael told you that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is seeking comment and trying to figure out how to add amphibians to the Lacey Act, which would mean that there would be regulations on importing any amphibian into the United States and transporting any amphibian across state lines, which essentially would mean that somebody would have to show for each amphibian that it has been tested for chytrid fungus and shown to not have the chytrid fungus. And so on our upcoming Save the Frogs Academy class, I'll be talking about chytrid fungus, and we will have Susan Jewell from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and she is pretty much in charge of that whole Lacey Act issue, and she will be giving us an update on what's happening from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service perspective. And I highly suggest all of you interested in the pet trade also go not only check out savethefrogs.com/pets, but savethefrogs.com/chytrid, which is CHYTRID. And there's lots of info there on chytrid, and in particular, there's a paper that I published in 2009, and it's called Chytridiomycosis, Amphibian Extinctions, and Lessons for the Prevention of Future Panzootics. A panzootic is a disease that travels all around the world, causing massive problems. And in that paper, I talk about some probabilities and basically the inevitability that if we're shipping 100 million amphibians around the world each year, which is what we are currently doing, that over the long term, if you say 100 years, that's 10 billion amphibians that we're shipping around the world. It's absolutely inevitable that one of those amphibians gets into the wild and spreads its disease, and that disease catches hold in native populations and causes significant problems. So the way we're going about things, the status quo, is just leading to inevitable extinctions and population decline in amphibians. So that's why it's so important to examine what we're doing and change what we're doing. So it's not only the fact that many amphibians are taken out of the wild, it's that even the ones that aren't taken out of the wild, all the amphibians, as we ship them around, we ship their diseases. Next thing I want to say is that Save the Frogs is always very dependent on volunteers, and we appreciate the support of our volunteers. And if anybody is very interested in the pet trade issue, and especially if you can dedicate 4 hours a week to helping out and commit to a year, we'd love your assistance focused solely on pet trade issues. One thing that we have going on right now is it would be great, as Michael said, there's all these forums and internet sites where pet people who buy and sell and want pets, frogs, hang out online, and it would be great to post info such as our info card about the pet so that people can see that and start thinking about that. And also, we're going to have this class that you're listening to right now as a video. We upload all these Save the Frogs Academy videos to youtube.com/SaveTheFrogs. And once we have that video, it'd be great if somebody out there could go to some of these forums, post a link, an announcement that the video exists, and that would be great if people could go have a look at the video. Because what we want is, especially with this class, we want to get the discussion started, give people lots of things to think about so that they can start questioning the status quo and figuring out ways to make things better. Michael's going to talk about ethics right now, and I definitely have some thoughts on that. I'll let him talk about that, and then perhaps when he's done with that, I'll give my thoughts on some of the ethical issues around the pet trade. So a couple other things. Michael was talking about how pets are very difficult to keep in captivity, and I know that's true. Even though I've never had a pet, I meet people all the time who tell me, "Oh, I used to have pet frogs, and you know what happened to them? Oh, they died." And yeah, all animals are going to die, but from what I gather, most of the people that I talk to who had pet frogs, they died prematurely because it is so hard to keep a frog in a tank when it's used to very different conditions out in the wild. Another thing, bullfrogs we talked about. In California, Save the Frogs is working to get a ban on the importation, sale, and purchase of American bullfrogs, which are not native to California. And we succeeded in Santa Cruz City and County and got legislation in place we're working on the state. And even though most of those frogs are being imported for use as food, there's definitely a bullfrog pet trade in California. And you can actually buy tadpoles of bullfrogs for 99 cents each. So basically, the government is allowing the sale for 99 cents of an animal that can cause potentially millions of dollars and irreversible damage to California's ecosystems. And as we saw in Michael's picture of some of these forums where they're selling amphibians, they were selling Cuban tree frogs in Florida, and they're already an invasive species in Florida that's known to cause problems. So why do we continue to allow a known problem to just keep causing more and more trouble? And another thing that sometimes people bring up, and they say, well, we need amphibians as pets because kids really love having them as pets, and they learn so much, and they get interested in protecting amphibians. And while it's certainly true that some kids do learn things, is it the best way to be teaching kids about frogs or anybody about frogs? I know that it's not necessary because I personally have never had a pet frog. So it's just not necessary to have a pet frog to develop a passion for amphibians or wildlife, or to develop the knowledge needed to enjoy them or protect them, because I'm here dedicating a large chunk of my life to saving frogs, and I've never had a pet. Now, also, I've personally educated well over 10,000 people face-to-face through presentations, and probably hundreds of thousands of more people online about frogs and why frogs are important and how to protect frogs. And that's without ever taking a live frog to any presentation. So I know that it's not necessary to make people like frogs. And then from my personal experience, being a guy who does not have pet frogs in the house, I still like to see frogs outside. And I've been to many exhibits of frogs in museums, some of them that are quite well known. And, I walk into a room and it's inside and there's brightly colored frogs in tanks, and there's some kind of rainforest looking plants there. And I don't walk out of there inspired, and I don't walk out of there thinking that was really an amazing experience that I'm going to remember for the rest of my life. Whereas when I go out into the wild to see frogs, I do feel that way. And personally, I'd rather go out into the wild, even if it's only once every few months, and see a native frog that's maybe brown and not too exciting, but if it's sitting there by the edge of a pond calling and it's in its wild home, then that to me is far more exciting than any frog that I ever see in a tank. So I know that people like to see frogs, but if you really like to see frogs, then go outside and get yourself more connected with nature and the way that things really are. And, most frogs live all over the world, so most people, regardless of where they live, if they wanted to go out and find frogs and they waited for the rainy season to come, they could probably go out and do that. And I think that experience is just much better on the environment and much more fulfilling for the frog lover. So with that, I will turn it back over to Michael, and then I'll come in later on to talk about ethics.
Thank you for that. So I'm going to touch on this briefly, but I want to get to the point about there's an argument, and that argument is captivity better than the wild? I mean, you can think about it like this: the frogs, they have all their needs met, they have, a aquarium to live in, they have food provided for them, and so there is this argument: is that better than the wild? And the unfortunate side effect, though, is that whereas some animals survive quite better in captivity, amphibians don't. And so most amphibians do die from this trade of the pet for the pet trade. And so, and I'd like to say that there is a fundamental uh, a right that is not being met, and that is amphibians have this right to be free. And so, animals that are living in the wild and have their freedom taken from them, this is a big ethical dilemma in our eyes, and this is something that I think is very, very important to understand. Is that all these amphibians have been literally stolen from their ecosystems and had those rights taken from them, and so it's very, very important that we think about that. And so Webster's dictionary defines a pet as a domesticated animal that's kept for pleasure rather than utility. Now, what's a pet to the frog owner, though? Because a domesticated animal, frogs, reptiles, amphibians, snakes, they are not domesticated animals. They are not dogs. They're not cats. They're not horses. And so these aren't animals that appreciate human comfort. They will not come when they are called. Um, these are wild animals. You know, they're wild animals that we have chosen. So people have chosen to put them in aquariums and terrariums, vivariums, for display or for their own, you know, beauty. And so it's very, very important that we think about this. That it's, you know, again, we do receive quite a bit of resistance on this issue, that these animals, you know, well, maybe freedom is better than captivity. And so it's important to understand that the individual that purchases that frog, you have chosen to be that steward of that frog, to take care of them, and also you have denied them a certain natural right. And so ethically, this has some issues. And so, Kerry, if you wanted to say anything else on that, I'm going to start moving forward, and we're getting a little close on time.
Yes, I'd like to say a few things. Yeah, ethics to me, what it comes down to is equality. And I know that very few humans would allow another human to be kept in a cage or a tank against their will, and very few people would want their child to be sold to somebody else to be kept in a tank so that somebody could stare at them and smile. And, you know, most people say, oh, but it's just a frog. But, you know, they're living organisms, and part of the problem with saying it's just a frog comes back to our anthropocentric view of the world that permeates most of human society, that I think is the root of most environmental destruction, that people think humans are superior and have superior rights to everything on this planet, but I don't think that's the case. And as I've said in the past, I support freedom for all sentient beings. Another thing people say, amphibians don't have feelings or things like that, but amphibians, you know, they're out there. They're fathers and mothers of tadpoles are out there guarding their offspring, and I just disagree saying amphibians don't have feelings. You know, if you cut its leg, it hurts, and it's got thoughts going through its head. So, you know, let's think about, would we allow this to happen to humans? And I don't think that most people would allow it for humans, so I don't think we should think that it's just, you know, every person should have the right to a pet frog. I'm not sure if that's how we should be going about things. Another thing is that this is kind of off of the ethical thing, just a different point I thought of. Some people say, oh, we need to be keeping amphibians as pets because we're keeping them from going extinct by having these populations in tanks, say, of Dendrobates terribilis, which lives in Colombia. Well, we're keeping it in tanks in America, and therefore we're keeping them from going extinct, that we're protecting the amphibians. But in reality, the trade, as we've learned about, is more of a threat to frogs than keeping them safe. And most of the people who have these frogs, and perhaps are even saying that they're helping keep them from going extinct, they're not connected to any kind of conservation actions. So, you know, they're not set up to be, or even attempting to be, replenishing wild populations with these frogs. They're not going back into any conservation project. So I just have a disagreement with the kind of argument that's being put forth that we need the pet trade to keep these frogs from going extinct. And also, is that the outcome we want? Do we want to be focusing our energy on having a few frogs left in tanks, or do we want to be spending that energy and the large amount of funds that people spend on these pet frogs, tanks, food, buying the frogs? Why don't we dedicate that to conservation project so that the frogs don't go extinct in the wild? We don't need the backup of frogs in tanks because, you know, our true goal is amphibians living out in the wild, safe from harm. So let's focus on getting rid of the threats to frogs. I'll put it back to you, Michael.
Great. Thank you for those thoughts. And so I'm going to be switching gears a little bit, and I want to again ask this question because this is also I want this this class to really question how you think about the pet trade, and I hope that this maybe asks some questions in your own mind. And I want to talk about this. So owning pets in general, it's like, can they inspire? So can captive amphibians inspire? And yes, they simply can. They can, and I can say this because it's the part where I'm going to talk about my own personal, I guess, history and why I got into conservation. And so while some people can never own a frog and it's fine and dandy, for me, as a child, I was not able to go into nature very much, and it was actually keeping reptiles, amphibians as pets that spurred this interest in amphibians and especially reptiles as well. And so what led to that was me working in pet stores. And actually, so for 3 years before I started a professional career as a biologist, I was working the pet trade. I was going to reptile shows. I was breeding large constrictor snakes and species of geckos. I had a few frogs, but at the time, when I was a younger man, my opinion of frogs was, why would I keep a frog? They typically are wild caught and they die. And so I preferred to keep reptiles. And so, however, though, it was that interest in amphibians and reptiles, excuse me, that made me want to go see them in the wild. And it was upon traveling to the Panamanian rainforest and seeing amphibians in the wild, guarding their young, and actually taking care of their eggs, protecting them from predators, and living and calling the way that they do, that I had a complete life change. And all of my pets, which at one time I owned 40 different individuals of reptiles and amphibians at one time, I parted with my collection, found them good homes, and I couldn't keep them in a tank because simply how could I replace that for them? And so I had a change of heart, a big change of heart. And so while they have this ability to inspire people, it's very, very important that we look at the institution of the pet trade and does it really do what it needs to do? Like, I was lucky and I became a biologist, but most people don't. They certainly do not. And amphibians are left on the shelf and they're treated merely as something to look at. And it's something that we hope that it can inspire greater conservation efforts if we are going to keep them as pets. And so the worst case scenario is that you can go from having animals that are truly inspirational for children, they're used as educators, but then they can be treated as mere trinkets, as toys, and something that can be treated as expendable and disposable. And if you haven't seen these, what's on the screen right now, these are little plastic bags with newts in them, baby turtles and goldfish, and they're completely sealed. And these can be found in markets in Asia. And obviously, if you're watching this, you should be rightfully so horrified and upset about that this happens. But this is the worst case scenario when we deny these animals their rights and treated them merely as things rather than as beings. And so it's so important that we look at where we are with the pet trade and what direction the pet trade is going. Because right now, unfortunately, for my history of working in the pet trade industry, to going to reptile shows, I see a lot of animals being treated as expendable and completely disposable, and all for the sake of profit. So it's important that we think about that. We ask ourselves these ethical questions, and we look at the future for the pet trade. But moving forward, here's what you can do to help pet frogs right now, pet frogs in the trade. And so here are a list of things that you can do to help. For one, if you do keep frogs or you're in the pet trade yourself, be a model in the herpetocultural industry. I hope that you are part of a reptile amphibian society or herpetology society, that you have your animals in the best care possible in vivariums that are similar to their natural environment. And I hope that you use those animals to inspire others to take care of them. So what we should do is that those animals that you keep, I would hope that you get children involved to say, hey, look at these awesome animals. Well, this frog comes from Panama, this frog comes from Australia, and that's where they naturally live. And so I hope that your animals aren't just sitting in a box and they're collecting, but rather that you use them as an educational tool to get people interested in nature and wildlife and to appreciate nature and wildlife. And so the pet trade, again, this is a call to action. Clean up your act. If anything bothers you about on this topic, if there's something that, oh, that's not the way it is, or that's something that was the worst of the worst. If there's something to be ashamed of, I think it's something that we should look at and clean up, because anyone in the pet trade knows about the high levels of parasite loads in amphibians, the amount of wild-caught amphibians that are kept as pets, and the amount of amphibians that die from poor husbandry. So this is a business, it's a multi-billion-dollar business every single year, and it's important to understand that the pet trade is for profit. It is. And while we can try and convince ourselves that these animals are beautiful and they're inspirational tools, unfortunately, much of it is behind to make money, and we're making these animals, or we're exploiting these animals for profit. And so if there is something that bothers you about this presentation or about the facts, please clean up your act and be a role model for a responsible amphibian trade. And so if you see animal abuse, spot it and stop it. So if you work as an importer and you see animals that are dying in cages, say something about it. Or if you work at a pet store and you carry wild-caught amphibians, tell your boss, tell the importer, say, hey, I don't want these animals. We only want captive-bred because we want to be a model for responsible herp keeping. And if you also work in the pet trade and you're a private breeder, I will say that to whom you sell your frogs to, I would hope that you make sure that they are within the best care possible that is available, and it isn't about making money, but unfortunately a lot of it is. So please stop that animal abuse, and also be a model in the herp industry. And so we also, other ways that we can help, we want to protect wild populations. So we need to support disease testing regulations. If you care about wild amphibians, then you should support disease testing regulations about the Lacey Act. And so very, very important to protect in wild-caught or wild population amphibians. And then if you don't keep amphibians, but you do want amphibians around your house, build a frog pond. SaveTheFrogs.com/ponds has many resources available for you to learn about how to build a frog pond, because habitat destruction is the number one reason that amphibians are going extinct. So we want to create habitat at our homes. And so this is a very simple way to have wonderful frogs come into your property and breeding and using that habitat to sustain their population. So create a frog pond. And if you do want to find amphibians in the wild, because this is something that now I'll never keep them in tanks anymore, but I love finding them out in the wild. And it's such a joy to be able to go out there and find them. And there's a few things that you want to remember when you go out. And so if you go out into nature and look for amphibians, remember, amphibians are highly sensitive creatures. And if you find a log and there's a salamander underneath it, always make sure to put that log back. If you go out and see a frog at the pond, maybe just take photos of it rather than grabbing it. On our hands, we have oils, and sometimes we might have bug repellent or sunscreen. And amphibians can absorb that through their permeable skin into the body, and it can harm them. So it's really important to be so gentle and identify the species too, because we don't want to be bothering endangered species, which many are becoming in our native areas, in our backyards, and only take photos and use that experience to share it with others. We want to share these wonderful experiences with nature, because when people go out for a hike, most of the time they're just blazing through the trails. They're maybe looking at birds, looking for large mammals, and they're not looking at the ground. They're not seeing the newt that's crossing their path. They're not listening for the frogs of the pond. And so if you find an amphibian and some hikers are coming by, share that with them. Most people will be delighted to see some animal that they probably have never even seen before. So share that experience with others and get people interested in amphibians. And so also it's so important that we spread the word. if everyone knew about the amphibian extinction crisis, that frogs were going extinct, all these amphibians were going extinct, we would greatly improve the state of amphibian conservation efforts around the world. So please share this video and tell your friends about it. And also get that card or find the card on the website and visit savethefrogs.com/pets for more information. So with that, I'm going to switch over to Save the Frog's positions on the pet trade because there are some myths and a little confusion about how Save the Frogs feels about the pet trade. And I wanted to take some time to clear that up right now. And one, Save the Frogs opposes the capture of wild amphibians for use as pets. It is unethical to remove amphibians from their homes instead of experiencing freedom, our most fundamental right. The frogs will experience crowded conditions and possibly even disease that thrives in such situations. So we definitely oppose the capture of wild-caught amphibians. And also, Save the Frogs opposes the transportation and importation of non-native amphibians for use as pets. Those who desire to use frogs as pets should stick with native, captive-raised amphibians or captive-bred so as to reduce the spread of infectious diseases, which can drive amphibian species to complete extinction. And then lastly, Save the Frog supports the regulation of amphibians with respect to disease-free certification systems such as that proposed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service as part of the Lacey Act. If we don't stop the spread of these amphibian diseases, we will continue to spread them around the world. So it's important that we support that Lacey Act action. And so we're trying to make the pet trade frog friendly. And there's many we've read on forums and received emails and threats saying that we're going to try and ban all frogs and stop the pet trade, and we're not trying to do that. Again, the pet trade is a multi-billion-dollar industry, and it's not necessarily in our interest right now. There's more pressing matters that Save the Frogs is hoping to do. So what we're trying to do is make the pet trade as frog-friendly as possible, and here are some ways that we're trying to do that. One, we just want to promote responsible amphibian keeping. If you're going to have a pet frog, remember to get captive bred and always know how to take care of your frog and learn more about that on savethefrogs.com/pets. And so we also go to reptile shows and amphibian shows to educate people because conservation is booths and tables is not something that is seen often at these reptile shows. Mostly it's just vendors selling animals. And so what we offer is education about the bigger picture, about where these frogs fit in, and educating people about responsible reptile and amphibian keeping, conservation issues that threaten these amphibians, and also just to spread the word about what's going on with amphibians around the planet. So we do education at reptile shows. And if you're interested in volunteering for Save the Frogs, this is something that we'd like to do more work at. Go to more reptile shows, amphibian shows to promote this amphibian conservation efforts. And if you'd like to get involved, please send me an email at starkey@savethefrogs.com, and I'll have more information about that later. And then we also, as Dr. Kriger said, remove invasive species and we restore natural ecosystems, like this bullfrog, which we had banned in the city of Santa Cruz. So invasive species cause so much harm to native populations, and it's important we remove those from ecosystems and restore those natural ecosystems. And on a final note, it's very, very important to acknowledge the success of captive breeding efforts. Captive breeding has saved amphibians from extinction. This photo here is from the El Valle Amphibian Conservation Center in Panama, where scientists discovered that all these species of amphibians in the Panamanian rainforest were going extinct from the chytrid fungus. And they went out and collected as many as they could, and they brought them into captivity. They treated them for the chytrid fungus, and they kept them to hopefully produce more amphibians by breeding them. And it's a good thing they did because all the species from that forest, many of them have gone extinct, actually. And so that we've lost so many species in the wild. But the problem, though, is that we have these amphibians. They're in zoos. People are now breeding them at homes or private hobbyists are breeding these animals. And while we have saved these species from extinction, if they're extinct in the wild, well, what's the point? I mean, what is the future for these wild animals that are still so threatened with extinction? So this photo right here, this shows actually a little Panamanian golden frog, and it's in an aquarium. And so when I was living in Panama and I visited the El Valle Amphibian Conservation Center, the hotel I stayed at had one of these frogs in about a gallon aquarium. And so then this animal is extinct in the wild. And so it's never going to be able to be returned. it has a high rate of getting the chytrid fungus and dying from it. And so, what is the future for the wildkin if we are to not stop the spread of disease or habitat destruction? Well, it's pretty simple. There won't be any wild amphibians left. And so if we do not take action now, then there will not be any habitat left. And so it's really important to understand that the pet trade has its place. It has inspired people, as you know, myself, to care about amphibians, to care about conservation. But if we don't promote proper husbandry, we don't stop this collection of wild-caught amphibians, if we don't regulate the spread of infectious diseases, then we're just going to keep hurting amphibian populations. And the pet trade is just another threat that amphibians face around the world. And so when they're up against bulldozers clear cutting their forests, you know, it's just another threat that they have to deal with. And we want to reduce that as much as possible and end those threats to amphibians. And so with that, I want to say it is up to you to save the frogs. Please share this video with your friends, with your family. Visit the SaveTheFrogs.com website, and that way we can better learn about the threats that face amphibians, not only with the pet trade, but also all the different threats. And we can learn together how to save the frogs. And so I want to thank you all for listening. And if you do have questions, start please chatting them in right now. And at the end, I have a few more announcements, and then we're going to talk about some of these questions. And Kerry, before I move on, do you want to say anything before I talk about Save the Frogs Academy?
Yes. Thanks a lot for the great summary of all of these issues related to the pet trade. And we did have a couple of questions and statements come in that I'm going to mention. And first, I want to thank PJ, who wrote in and said, I can't understate how much I love everything you two are saying. I feel like I'm listening to kindred spirits, but with a scientific background, or with scientific backgrounds. This is such an important issue that's ignored in the case of sentient beings who aren't mammals or birds. And so thanks for the positive words. And yeah, it's true. If we look at our history of what are the animals that humans traditionally care about, it's just based on our cultural upbringing that we think some species deserve more rights than others. And so, you know, what Save the Frogs does is try to make people know that amphibians are important as well. It doesn't matter if they're small, doesn't matter if they're, you know, slimy or weird looking, they still deserve rights like all the other species. Now, we got a kind of long one that came in that brings up many topics that I've heard these, we'll call them arguments or lines of logic stated before many times, and there are many issues that I have with them. So the person wrote in and said, the food, bait, and accidental transport via produce, that means shipping, say, cauliflower around and having frogs that have jumped on it, carry vastly more frogs than the pet trade. Now, what this statement is basically saying is that because there are, and first off, we won't even get into whether or not it's a true statement that those other reasons that people are shipping frogs are even truly bigger problem than the pet trade. But regardless, it doesn't matter because the line of logic is incorrect and it's dangerous. Because what it's saying is that if there are other threats to frogs, then the threat that we're talking about is no longer important. Amphibians have so many threats to them. We need to deal with all the threats. That's why frogs are the most rapidly disappearing animals on the planet, because they have so many threats. We can't just say, we won't deal with this one threat because there's other threats. We need to fix all the problems that amphibians face, especially the ones that we understand. If we go back 15 years in time, no one even knew the chytrid fungus existed until 1997, 1998. That was a problem that we couldn't even do anything about. And who knows how many driving amphibians to extinction that we don't even know about. We're fortunate to know what many of these threats are. To know the threats is the first step to be able to fix the threats. So if we know that the pet trade is a problem, and we know why the pet trade is a problem, then let's go to work fixing the problem. Threats are not mutually exclusive. So not to drag this on much longer, but analogy I came up with a few minutes ago is it would be like me saying, hey, you're fine with me chopping off your fingers on your left hand because your right arm already got chopped off? No, it doesn't work that way. All these things are problems. Let's fix every single problem that we can. So continuing on with this statement, which the person says, most examples of chytrid movement show movement not via pets but via produce. That is simply not true. And something that I learned is one of the most important concepts I learned during my entire PhD, the more you look, the more you find. If I go out looking for frogs one night and I spend 5 minutes out there looking for frogs, maybe I'll find some frogs, but if I spend 5 hours out there looking for frogs, I'm going to find a lot more frogs. Same thing. If we do more studies on the pet trade, we'll find more chytrid in it. But do we need to do more studies? We've already got studies that show chytrid in the pet trade. And not only that, we've got basic lines of logic that say if we ship hundreds of millions of frogs around the world, it's inevitable that some will have diseases, some will escape, some will get set free, some will have water that goes out into the environment, and we know from history, from past history, that the chytrid fungus does an amazing job living and surviving anywhere in the world where it's cool and moist. There's a lot of places in the world that are cool and moist. I live in Santa Cruz, California. It's cool and moist here. Sierra Nevadas up in the mountains, it's cool and moist. Washington State, North Cascades, New Zealand, Andes, Costa Rica, and the mountains all over the world. There's so many places with perfect conditions for the chytrid fungus because the chytrid fungus is a super invader. It just does an amazing job living out in the wild and finding frogs to infect. So the chytrid is in the pet trade. It will continue to be in the pet trade. We can't, there's hundreds of millions of zoospores on a single frog potentially. So it's out there. So I'm going to continue with this question, which had so many statements in it, and it says, produce, mostly bananas, took chytrid to New Zealand, most of Australia, much of the Caribbean. I have never seen a scientific paper that had those statements in it, and also because the chytrid fungus arrived in Australia at least as early as 1979, but scientists didn't even know it existed until 1997-98. We know from museum specimens that now we know that it was already in Australia by 1979, and it was actually within a few months of that first record, and that first record came from the same mountain range where one of the earliest extinctions in Australia is from. The southern day frog and southern gastric brooding frogs went extinct almost immediately after that first record of chytrid in Australia. And we don't know that that came from bananas or produce, so that statement is simply incorrect. And then it goes on to talk about that most people who love amphibians don't want to harm them, and I agree with that. Most people who love amphibians don't want to harm them. They like amphibians. But that doesn't mean that the actions and the things that take place to get that amphibian to them, and what happens if they release their amphibians because they didn't know any better, it doesn't make the threats disappear just because they love amphibians. A person can love amphibians, but their actions may still hurt amphibians. And then these are exactly the people we want as ambassadors for frogs and their conservation. We don't want to alienate them. Many of the world's most dedicated frog conservationists started their experience with frogs in captivity. Yes, you can come to love amphibians and their conservation through the wild, but do we really want to remove one of the key engines for developing conservationists? And I do agree. We want as many people liking and enjoying and learning about frogs as possible, but there are many ways to go about doing that, which I discussed before, and there are ways that do it without having unintended ecological consequences that could drive not just one species to extinction, but potentially hundreds of species being driven to extinction because of one problem that was caused by a person who may have loved amphibians. So there's so many ways to help amphibians. There's so many ways to get people involved in amphibians. So, we just want to be as careful as possible, and there's always better ways to do things, and that's what we're in a search for. Let's see.
I can
I'm
answer a few
looking through.
questions.
Yeah, go on, Michael. There's some other questions that you've probably had a chance to read,
Great,
and
yeah.
yeah, so go for it.
So
Thanks.
there was a couple questions about just captivity in general, and one question was, do they live longer in the wild? And so I may not have made this too clear. I didn't talk too much about this. But when amphibians are brought into captivity, so if they are, wild-caught amphibians, they typically do not survive long. And actually, I think it's about 70 to 80% of wild-caught amphibians die if they do not receive that that a level of care that they need. I mean, because they have parasite loads, et cetera. And so it's very important that to understand that they typically in captivity, if they're wild caught, live shorter in captivity on average, like because so many do die from this. But actually, the fact is that if someone is a dedicated herpiculturist, they know what they're doing. Amphibians in captivity do exceed, their lifespans in the wild probably triple fold because they do not have that threat from predators. They're receiving the ample supply of food. So while they do live in captivity longer, it's also important to understand too that again um, it's just they again denied that freedom. But yeah, so as long as they are captive bred, this is a good thing. And I wanted to ask talk more about frogs in captivity. Let me just find it really quick. And so about how they come like into the country. So one person asked, how is it legal that they come into the United States? Well, again, it's a business, and so if people are doing this not illegally, they can get permits with the country they're taking the frogs from, and then they get entry permits into the United States, and then when they're here, they can sell them. And so, but there's many endangered species that are protected by the CITES Act that get illegally imported. For example, the tiger leg tree frog, a frog in the genus Agalicnus, it looks very similar to the red-eye tree frog, except that it doesn't actually has black eyes and has tiger stripes. This has been found to be illegally exported out of Guatemala, and this frog is a critically endangered species. And so a lot of this trade is legal, but much of it is illegal too because there is this black market trade. And so I want to answer a question too from Jeremy Pelsinski, who's a great volunteer. And so first, thanks Michael and Kerry for another great class. I definitely support STF's stance on pet frogs and ethical pet care. I wanted to ask about watching and appreciating frogs, captive versus the wild. One thing we are seeing, particularly in our national parks, is the destruction of these areas because of the huge amount of annual foot traffic from people visiting these parks. With now over 7 billion people on the planet, could we see this happen if everyone went in the wild every time they wanted to see a frog? That is a great question. And that's something that I didn't touch on from the sense of so there's this hobby called herping, which is basically you go out and you look for reptiles and amphibians. And it's great. You go into nature and you find these amazing animals. But even this act of going out to these areas has, scared amphibians away. It's caused some degradation to the habitat. And so it is very, very important that we respect the habitat as much as possible. And unfortunately, it's actually before I say that, it's very, very important to respect laws. So one thing that's so important is to respect park laws. If there are signs that say stay on the trail, this is a federal park, respect those laws because the whole idea is that we don't want to go out and destroy this habitat by walking through it, and because foot traffic does cause quite a bit of harm to the plants and any animals that live there, and so we want to respect those laws as much as possible. And also too, if in the herping community, if there are people that go out and visit these same sites, give the animals a break too. One thing is that people bring them out, they take lots of photos, and it can be quite stressful. And so it's very, very important that we do definitely respect the animals we're handling. And with more and more people, coming out on the planet, or living on the planet, we are going to see more foot traffic to these nature areas. I'd like to think that there will be a trend of just responsible, um, nature viewing, so that at one point we don't even flip logs anymore, and that when we see that salamander crossing our path, it might be the only one that we get to see that year, but that was that special experience that we hope people that will, like that experience. Or we don't have to go grab that frog. We use a telephoto lens to view it, or we use binoculars to view it. So at some point, we might have to switch to these ethics of just going out and looking in the wild, because we don't want to keep destroying this habitat just by our presence being there. So I hope that answers your question. Kerry, did you have any more questions you want to answer before I move on?
Well, let's see. I just want to say something that I have not said, but I want to make it very clear that there's a lot of focus on chytrid fungus. Let's just test it for chytrid fungus, and if it doesn't have the chytrid fungus, everything is okay. But amphibians can have many different diseases, and as I said before, chytrid fungus, even though it's probably the most significant disease of wildlife that there is to any kind of wildlife, we didn't even know it existed until about 15 years ago. There's tons of wildlife diseases that affect frogs that we just haven't discovered yet. There's so few biologists studying them. So, even if we're testing for chytrid fungus, if we keep transporting all these animals all around, there's other diseases that they can spread, and some of them may end up, who knows, being as bad or worse than the chytrid fungus. So it's just something people should always keep in mind, that it's not just the chytrid fungus. There's lots of potential disease threats when you send amphibians around the planet. Back to you, Michael.
Great, thank you. I also got another question about captive bred versus wild caught. And I just want to touch on that very briefly before moving on, because we are starting to run out of time. It is very important that we go and buy pet amphibians. The question was, how can you verify that it's a captive bred versus wild caught? And I didn't mention this during the presentation, but I should have. And I do again want to pay respect to captive breeders in the sense of how we have gone from leaps and bounds to the proper care of amphibians, and there has been a big movement to captive bred breed amphibians. And there are many species that in the last 5-10 years had never been for sale as a captive bred individual. So there are many more captive breeding efforts going out, and so there are many amphibians that are captive bred when you go to the pet store. And the pet store, I mean, they will tell you, and they want you to buy a captive bred frog, because it's actually less work for them. Because one, it's going to be more expensive. Wild caught is usually cheaper because there's a big problem that it might die. And so they want, most ethical vendors and breeders, they want you to buy captive bred. And even in the pet trade movement, there is this pull to go towards captive bred, because there are so many problems associated with wild caught animals. And so simple questions of asking and talking to the individual, if they're being somewhat sketchy about the sale, I mean, then that's a problem right there. But most people will say, and it's typically frowned upon if you're lying about where your animals come from. And there is somewhat, people will, they're being like, oh, those guys only sell wild caught and they lie to their customers. There is this somewhat of a pressure from other vendors too, because people that are breeding these animals, many of them do want the best for those animals. And also too, about when we go out and find amphibians, I had a great suggestion about, in Australia and New Zealand, some of the when they go out look for amphibians, they actually use footwear that can be disinfected because of this spread of chytrid fungus. And so they also use gloves before touching anything out in the bush. And so that was a great statement that it is, again, we're going to have to start rethinking how we go out and look for amphibians in the wild, because at some point we're going to be spreading this disease, incidentally, which is just part of how, I mean, unfortunately, where we go, we bring things with us that isn't good for the frogs. And so it's very, very important just to respect nature as much as possible and leave it be as much as possible too, and be safe about that. And this is something that we've been, I'm going to add to the Save the Frogs website about finding amphibians in the wild and about the best way to do it. So stay tuned for that. And I'm going to move forward, Kerry. Are you okay with that?
Yeah, keep going.
Great. Okay, so gonna switch gears here a little bit and talk about some upcoming Save the Frogs Academy classes. So on this Wednesday, the 28th at 11 a.m. San Francisco time, I will be talking about the natural history and threats facing California amphibians, and we'll go down the list of some of the really cool amphibians you can find in California. So that'll be a fun talk. September 1st, 5 p.m., how university students can help save the frogs. And that following Wednesday, and another intro to amphibian conservation led by Dr. Kerry Kriger, but it will be in Espanol, in Spanish. So I highly recommend, if anyone is from a speak Spanish or from a Spanish-speaking country, please share that so we can have lots of callers or attendees join that call. And then the next one will be on September 8th, where Dr. Krieger and I will lead a class about dissections and the threats to amphibians and, again, the ethical issues surrounding the dissections of frogs. And then on the 11th of September, we're again going to have that chytrid fungus class with that special guest, and we will be definitely talking about the Lacey Act and how you can help out further with that and how we can get the ball moving on getting this supporting disease testing regulations. And then on the 15th, we're going to talk about how to organize a frog event in your city. So there's many places where we can have frog-friendly events that bring further awareness to amphibian conservation. And this will be a great class on talking about how you as a volunteer, as a student, can go out and have an event for Save the Frogs to educate people in your area. And then on the 18th, we're going to talk about volunteering for Save the Frogs. And so how you can better be a more effective volunteer and how you can further help out. On the 22nd, we're going to be Dr. Krieger and I will be joined by Save the Frogs Ghana's executive director, Gilbert Adum, and we're going to talk all about what's been happening in Ghana. And so Save the Frogs Ghana is the first international branch of Save the Frogs, and we're very proud of the conservation efforts they've led in their country. They have gone leaps and bounds since their creation in 2011, and there are so many amazing things that the team at Save the Frogs Ghana has accomplished. On the 25th, we're going to talk about another local issue of California, about the Sharp Park wetland, which is actually a golf course, and how we want to revert it back into a wetland. And we're also going to talk about the spread of the invasive bullfrog on the western states of the United States. And on October 2nd, we're going to have a very special class about saving the mountain yellow-legged frogs. And if you are in California or just interested in this, I highly recommend you attend this class because these frogs are in desperate need of help. And so the mountain yellow-legged frog has gone from over 90% of its habitat, and right now they're deciding about protecting many acres for this frog, and also the Yosemite toad as well, and it's receiving a lot of negative resistance. And so we need to bring awareness to this issue so we can protect these very special frogs in the Sierra Nevada. And October 6th, we're going to have a class dedicated to teachers. Anyone can attend because we are all truly educators, but this will be for teachers and how teachers can better help save the frogs and bring amphibian conservation into their classrooms. And you can register at savethefrogs.com/classes and or savethefrogs.com/academy. And with that, I have a few announcements. I want to talk about another big event coming up. We're going to have our second annual eco tour to Belize coming in June 2014. Please go to savethefrog.com/ecotours to learn all about this exciting experience. We're very excited because the first eco tour was held last July. It was incredible. We found so many different species of amphibians and also birds and other wildlife. We had a really great time. And so we'd love for you to come out with us again this coming year. And then Save the Frogs art contest is winding down. October 15th is the deadline. And also the Save the Frogs poetry contest is also coming to an end. And so we want to get your submissions in as soon as possible. So finish that art, write up those poems, and send them in to us. You can find instructions about this contest at savethefrogs.com/art or /poetry. So please send those submissions in. Again, yes, Save the Frogs poetry contest. We've had many entries from around the world, and we hope we can hear one or read one from you coming up. And then 6th annual Save the Frogs Day is on April 26, 2014. Please start thinking about those events now, and hopefully we can have many, many events this following year. We're going to try to make it the largest day of amphibian conservation, which every single Save the Frogs Day has been, so we are definitely confident the 6th annual will be even better and bigger. So you can find out more information about registering your event at savethefrogs.com/day, or you can find out events near you coming in the following months, or learn about previous events to get some inspiration about how you can hold an awesome event. So, and please also SaveTheFrogs.com, or Save the Frogs is a nonprofit organization, and we rely on support from supporters like you, people that love frogs. We've never received any money from any government, and so we rely on your support. Become a member of Save the Frogs, and you can donate at SaveTheFrogs.com/donate. And please, for this special episode, we really want to ask that you donate for our work in Colombia, Save the Frogs Cali in Colombia, with their work at educating schools and remote regions of Colombia. We really would like to fund this. We need a few $100s more to make that happen, and it would be great to support our friends in Colombia. So, and again, thank you guys so much for your support. Please visit our gift center to get a great shirt or stickers, wristbands, and so you can help better save the frogs. And so with that, again, I want to thank you so much for attending this webinar. It was really a great experience to talk about this. And I hope that you please share this webinar with friends or people that are interested in the pet trade. So because we want to bridge the gap, we want to make the pet trade as frog friendly as possible. And so we understand the threats and we know what we can do to make it better. So please share this with your friends and let's start a discussion about how we can make the pet trade as frog friendly as possible. So with that, thank you so much for your support. Thank you, Dr. Kriger, for offering his expertise. And again, thank you so much. And together we can save the frogs. Thanks again.
Thanks, everyone.